Let's begin the process by talking about polygons. So let's go ahead and open up Maya, and I've just got a few objects already dropped in here, and we're going to use these to talk about the first kind of geometry that we can work with in Maya, and those are called polygons. And this is going to be one of the most common types of geometry that you're going to see out there, and you're going to be working with probably here in Maya. And so let's take a look at what polygons are all about. So if I go ahead and select one of these objects, you can see that I've just got a cube here. Now, right now I'm in object mode, so I can move around, I can rotate the object, but I can't access any of the components of a polygon, which is what we want to talk about, the different little pieces that make up a polygon object. So what we want to do is actually go to component mode. There are a few ways that we can go to component mode. You can see this button is highlighted right up here. We can select the button right next to it, which is going to be select by component type. And you can see how the lines change from green to blue. Okay, now as I hover over some of these components, I can actually select those. So you can see I'm getting a highlight on these edges. That's because we have this edge highlighted. Okay, we also have different components here where we can select the points or vertices or a vertex if you're talking about one. Okay, so I'll go back to object mode. We can also hit F8 to toggle back and forth between object and component mode on our keyboard. We can also right click. Okay, in the marking menu we can go ahead and select the kind of component that we want, and it'll automatically take us into component mode. Okay, so now that we know how to get into component mode, let's talk about the actual components that make up a polygon object. And there are three components that are very important that we'll talk about. The first is going to be a vertex. Okay, so a single point here in 3D space has really no size, no mass or anything. It's just basically a coordinate in 3D space. Okay, and you can call them, some people call them points. One of them is called a vertex. If you have more than one, I believe vertexes or vertices, either one are actually correct. I usually use vertices more because that's just the way I learned it. And so basically it's just this polygon object is basically a network of these points in space. So each one has an X, Y, and Z coordinate. So you can see as we rotate around it's in a particular position. But without the other components, there's really nothing to see. I mean, we can visually see a point in our display because we have these enlarged dots here, but really the point itself doesn't really have a size. And so if we were to render just the points, we wouldn't be able to see anything if we didn't add any geometry to that. Okay, the next component that is going to connect the points together are going to be these edges. So if I right click and go to edges, I can select the actual edges and the lines. Okay, and these are just lines connecting two points together, two vertices together. So you can see that we have the points that make up this cube, and then those are all connected by various lines here, or edges. Okay, and again, the edges don't really have a size. We aren't really seeing the edges when we render something. We just have a nice visual representation of where those are. You can see it's kind of where the direction changes. Now the part of the polygon object that we're going to see are going to be the faces. So if I right click and go to face, I can actually click on that particular face. And this is the actual, what we call geometry, that's being created by these edges. Okay, so you have to have at least 3 edges to make a polygon face, right? So that makes sense. If you have a triangle, that's kind of the fewest number of edges that you can have, because if you have 2 edges, you don't really have any sort of geometry there. Okay, so as long as you have at least 3, you can also have, in this case, we have a polygon face that has 4 sides. So you can have a triangle, you can have kind of a square-shaped polygon, which is probably going to be the most common in many applications, although in some triangles will be very common as well. And then you can have polygons that have more than 4 edges. So when you hear the term triangles or tris, that's pretty self-explanatory. You've got a 3-sided polygon. When you hear the term quad, that's going to be a 4-sided polygon. Those are going to be very common for sculpting applications. Many applications that we use to go and take to sculpt geometry will work better because they're subdividing the geometry, and quad geometry subdivides in a much cleaner way than other types of faces. So in those types of applications, quads are going to be most prevalent. And we also have anything over 4 sides, and those are going to be referred to as n-gons. So if you have something with 5 sides, 6 sides, 7 sides, 20 sides, those are going to be referred to as n-gons. So those are kind of the 3 types of faces: tris, triangles, quads, and n-gons. So just keep that in mind. The types of faces that you're going to be using in your particular application or in your particular job will depend on what that is. Some cases you may want to use triangles in a game application. They may be fine. Quads may be important for a certain job if you're going to be doing some subdividing and so forth. So it all depends on what you're actually working with. Okay. And in the end, when we render this, these are kind of turned into triangles anyway. Okay, so it's because that's kind of the lowest possible unit of a polygonal geometry. Okay, so we talked about the components of a polygon object. We talked about the different kinds of faces, and you can see we can go ahead and select those. So now let's talk about some of the characteristics of polygon objects. If we move over here to the right, you can see that we have a completely different shape. So this is a cylinder shape instead of a cube, but it's still made of polygons. Okay. Now, one of the characteristics of polygons is that the lines that join the vertices together are straight lines. They're completely straight. And so what we can do is, if we take a look at this, what's supposed to be a perfect circle, you can see that it's what we call faceted. So we got a straight line here, straight line here, straight line here. And so instead of getting a nice smooth circle, you get faceting. Now, with any of these polygon objects, we can go ahead and modify these. If we come over here into the inputs, you can see we have a polycylinder item here. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I want to go ahead and just dial the subdivisions down so we can see this even more clearly. So with 8 subdivisions, you can see even though this is a cylinder shape, okay, if we go to the top, you can see that it is very faceted. We're not getting a smooth shape. So that's one of the things about polygons. If you want to get something that's very smooth, you're going to have to add more polygons. Okay, and that takes more memory and takes longer to render. The computer takes more computer power to think about it and process it. And so that's one of the balancing acts that you get into when you're working with polygons is how can I get the model looking the way that I want it to look and still be able to handle it with the computer or the game engine or whatever it is. And so you can see as I increase these subdivisions that circle gets smoother and smoother. The price I pay for that is the fact that I've got a lot more polygons to deal with here than I had before. Okay, but I do get something much smoother. So those are the choices that you're going to have to make as you get into modeling. How many polygons can I add to get the smoothness that I want, and also optimize the model so that it is not too heavy. So we don't want to overdo everything and just have everything completely smooth because we don't really need all of that geometry coming with us. Okay, now there are options for creating or giving the illusion of smoothness. For instance, if I take all of these edges, okay, these actually have something called normals, which are kind of tell Maya how to shade the surface. And right now, they're kind of hardened. So each one of these faces you can see gets distinct shading, and there's a nice distinct line between those. Okay, so if I were to go ahead and take the edges, go to normals, and soften those normals, you can see from the side it actually looks fairly smooth because it's blending that shading between those different edges, even though we haven't added any resolution at all. So you get a smoother effect from the side, but if you go to the top, it still looks the same because that silhouette's not going to change. To change the silhouette, you're going to have to add resolution in some way, whether that's actually increasing the number of polygons or using some sort of smoothing algorithm. And we'll talk about smoothing in a couple of lessons when we talk about subdivision surfaces. Okay, so some of the advantages of working with polygons are that you can add detail in specific areas. And so here we have a polygon torus. Okay, so if I wanted to just add resolution in here, I could do that. And let's look at some of the common polygon modeling tools that we can use. You'll notice here that we actually have a polygon shelf. Okay, and that's going to come with your installation of Maya. We also have a custom shelf, and we can start to add some of these tools to our shelf if we want to, but a lot of these are located up here. Okay, you're going to have your extrude, which is going to be very common. So if I select a face, and you can click on this, or we can go to Edit Mesh, Extrude, you can see that I can either use the manipulators, or I can pull out the thickness here. Okay, and that actually allows me to pull geometry out of the surface. Okay, we can also insert edge loops. So insert edge loop tool. You can see how that loop is formed from those quads. It goes all the way around, and so we can really quickly drop in extra edge loops. Okay, and there are also a couple of options for splitting polygons. One of these, if we go to Shift, right click, we can go to Split, and there are two options here: Split Polygon Tool or Interactive Split Tool. This is new in 2012, and then the Split Polygon Tool is common to older versions. In this, we can just come in and click and add edges in here. Okay, and at any time, if we want to add a tool that we're using to the shelf, you just Control Shift and click on that, and it'll add it to our shelf, and then we can go ahead and use that. You can see we've extruded all of those polygons. All right. Now, real quickly, before we go to NURBS, talk about NURBS, polygon primitives are basically these different shapes that we can bring in. We can just go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and here we have a list of these primitives. So these are good starting points. A lot of the models that you're going to create, you'll be able to use primitives to start with and then modify them as you go along. Keep in mind this interactive creation. If I have this turned on and I go to create a cube, let's say, nothing is created until I draw into the viewport and then drag it up. Now if I have this turned off, then if I create a cube, it's just going to be dropped onto the origin. That's typically how I work, but you may find that the interactive creation works better for you. Okay, so experiment a little bit with the polygon primitives. Bring some different primitives in. You can change over here in the inputs. You can change some of the values for subdivision. You can also, before you create them, you can see the option boxes. You can also go in and set all of those values beforehand if you know the resolution that you want. Okay, so that is a quick look at polygons, what they are, what they're made of, some of the characteristics of polygons, and then also some of the tools that we can use to build polygons. And we'll go through those tools more and more as we go through the process of building our project. So the next thing that we want to talk about is a different type of geometry. This geometry is going to be very smooth, but it's going to have its own challenges, and that geometry is called NURBS. So we'll go ahead and talk about that in the next lesson.